What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel. And today we are talking XFL DFS. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all content goes live. We are brought to you by Prize Picks, and they have a first match deposit bonus up to $100 when you click the link in the video description below. And this being an XFL video, I want to talk to you about a little promo we have over at Stokastic where you can get 50% off your first week. Includes all the content we talk about, the projections, all the up-to-date analysis. And you can find that by clicking the link in the video description below. 50% off gets you your first week for just $11.50, excuse me. To be clear, $11.50. All right. I have been ill all week. I blew my news about 14 times in preparation for this video. I am up to date on the news of the XFL as of this moment, but this is the most ridiculous league I've ever been a part of. The teams' rosters change so much. It is incredibly hard to follow, so make sure you stay up to date with projections and everything like that because teams are signing guys off the street days before the game, and they're coming out there and getting carries and catching balls. It's truly ridiculous. But we will kick things off, bring you over to the DraftKings page. And as usual, we'll go game by game and team by team within that, which means we start with Houston taking on Orlando. And what a game we have here. This game is a 9-point spread, 9 points in favor of Houston, a 37.5 total. So Houston immediately has the best team total on the board, which we need to take notice of right away. And as far as the plays in this game go, excuse me, I accidentally removed something from one of my tabs I need. All right, here it is. As far as teams go in this league, Houston is one of the best ones. They're 3-0 now. They've not really been tested too much either. Crushed the Guardians, beat Arlington, and they just beat the Brahmas. So this looks like one of the better teams on paper this year. They've used two quarterbacks on occasion here, with Cole McDonald essentially coming in and being the situational rusher. And then most of the passing work has been Brandon Silvers, but we still haven't really seen, like an elite game from Brandon Silvers, even though we like this offense quite a bit. And you're just seeing a lot of cannibalization from the rest of like the quarterbacks here, just kind of edging him out as far as this Houston offense goes. There's other players like you'd rather get over him for the most part, but Silvers in this instance comes in with a fairly affordable price. Less and less is McDonald playing, but when he does play, it's like very clearly rushing situations, which other quarterbacks have and Silvers doesn't. So for the time being, he's just going to be a GPP dart throw, even in a game like this where they have a massive spread and a massive total. We saw this with Arlington last week, where this league is so volatile that it doesn't make a ton of sense. Just load up on a guy who clearly is going to be in a timeshare, it seems, through the year. Going to the running back position for Houston, Max Borghi did practice. The Q tag, I'm not really too worried about when he's healthy. He handles the full workload, and it's not really that close anymore. At first, I thought it was going to be, but it has slowly become more and more Borghi as the season has gone on. If you look at this team over the last 3 weeks, he's handled at least 60% of the touches in all three. Bryson Aline came up for 37% last week. That was because Borghi exited for a short period of time. Holly doesn't play running back. He's a slot receiver, like full-on slot receiver. He's not even dabbling at running back. He plays a ton. It's just like he has a horrific target share. So I was guilty. If you watched last week's video, I played quite a bit of Nick Holly. It did not work out. And the last thing to say on him is his route rate did drop from 100% in week 2 to 55% in week 3. So yeah, I was fooled. Won't be fooled again. He's hitting the bench for other players, more talented players, as he should. He's been awful this year. Going to the actual wide receiver position, this is where we can have some fun. The tough part is stacking this team. Do you really want to run like two of these guys without the QB because of that timeshare? I mean, you could. I find it a little difficult. So I've basically just been playing one of Jontre Kirkland or Deontay, Burnett when I possibly can. And last week it was Kirkland that had the big game. We've seen Burnett have the big game in this spot before. I don't really think there's too much separating them. You look at routes run, it's basically even between these guys, a slight edge to Burnett. But I mean, we're talking razor thin splits here. I don't have a preference too strongly between them. But if I had to pick, I think you could probably buy low on Burnett after the prime time game we saw out of our friend John Trey Kirkland last week. Beyond that, we get to the wide receiver 3. I think it should be Travell Harris. Travell Harris was injured in week 2, came back last week, only 50% of the routes. I think that's more just a factor of the injury because in week 1, he was at 85%. I'm going to try to buy low on Travell Harris at probably low ownership here. The problem is you also have a couple other receivers that are going to see the field. Nick Holley being one of them with that 55% route rate. Can't wait till he's off the field. But Ben Putman was at 55% last week, and Cedric Byrd was at 39%. Even Justin Smith was at 21%. I don't think these guys are going anywhere, so I expect this team's running 4 wide every play for reference, but I don't think this rotation is going anywhere. So to break it all down, you very clearly have 2 every down receivers in Burnett and Kirkland. I think Travell Harris has that ability based on week 1, now coming off the injury, but it's not certain. And the rest of these guys are full timeshare, full-blown timeshare. Very difficult to get unless you're just playing the largest of GPPs. And we don't have a lot of clarity in this league, so I think eating chalk in some spots is okay, and this is one I'm probably going to continue to eat chalk on. Going to the QB position for Orlando. Orlando is awful. They have the lowest implied team total on this slate by a wide margin. It is 14 points. Again, they are 9-point underdogs here. And this team is a full-blown disaster. They have, my notes for this team are ridiculous. They've essentially played 3 different quarterbacks at this point. They might be playing 4. They now have DeAndre Francois on the roster. So you have no clarity there. I think, like Paxton Lynch has played a fair amount. And if there weren't other better GPP quarterbacks, I might have some interest in him. But just my notes on the Guardians so far this year, they're 0-3, hasn't been particularly close in most of these games. They've just churned their roster like crazy. This is why I've been frustrated with the league. They signed Dan Williams, who'd already been cut by San Antonio. They cut Steven Guidry themselves, cut Deontay Byrd, signed Quentin Flowers, cut Kelvin Taylor at running back, signed Devin Darrington on running back, traded away Javonte Payton at receiver. Like, what the hell was this team doing all offseason? They're taking guys off the street in week 3 and throwing them into the fire. Now, for Devin Darrington, at least he was hurt, so we'll talk about him in a second, but that just speaks to the volatility with this team. They're a team I'm getting 1 player maximum of just because of how awful this team truly is. And it starts with quarterback. They don't play 1 clear player. Lynch has played most of the time. He actually has a decent rushing floor, but I just don't see any need to play a guy like him. I would rather just eat the stone chalk and get different elsewhere. I don't see any need to play Orlando. At the running back position, so Jameis Martin is still here, but they cut Kelvin Taylor and they signed a guy who'd previously been on the roster, and Devin Darrington. He got hurt. He's not in the player pool. We have no idea what this timeshare is going to look like this week. The team is so bad, I'm probably just not playing any of them. But again, Devin Darrington, not in the player pool. Kelvin Taylor, not on the roster. At receiver, some of these players are on the roster, some of them are not. So to break this down, it's a complete mess. Cody Latimer basically is their wide receiver 1 at this point. He's not really playing tight end, so don't look too much into that designation. But when you look at routes, 76% last week for Latimer. He's just been their most efficient player. He leads the team in targets pretty clearly. He's at 8 in back-to-back weeks. And then Charleston Rambo and Eli Rogers are the other 2 full-time players here. You have Eli Rogers at a 76% route share, Charleston Rambo at an 82% last week. But one player that's kind of emerged for them is Lance Lenoir, 76% of the route rate. I think he's going to round out their 3 wide receiver formations. So it looks like you've got Latimer playing this pseudo receiver tight end as your 1. Some combination of Rogers, Rambo, and Lenoir as your actual wide receiver 2. I have no idea who it is. Last week, they all saw 4 targets exactly. And again, Lenoir didn't play in week 1, so we don't have anything about him. Rambo has been wind sprinting all over the field. Rogers is actually, former NFL player, but his route rate has been clearly behind Rambo. I think I'm just going to take a shot on Lenoir at 3K as like a one-off in some lineups. Him and Latimer are the two guys I like most. But again, you can throw some darts on these guys. Just don't expect too much from Orlando. They're a disaster. Going to game 2, we have San Antonio taking on Seattle. This game, a little more interesting. Overall, the spread is 4.5 in favor of Seattle. The total is 40.5, the second highest on the board here. We'll start with the San Antonio side of things. This team is 1-2. I think they might be a little better than their record indicates, but not by much. They lost to the Battlehawks in week 1. They kicked 3 field goals, so they kind of failed themselves. In week 2, they beat the Guardians, which doesn't say much. And in week 3, they played the Roughnecks, who were just clearly better. So I think we're very much dealing with a middle-of-the-pack team here. They did cut Dan Williams, who we just talked about has been re-signed by another team. They cut Ben Beasy, who's a tight end. And they have TJ Vasher injured. So they went out and they signed Emmanuel Butler after they signed Travis Tavinen last week. So another team completely in flux. What we do know about this team is that they're playing Jack Cohn at quarterback, and he has been wildly average to below average. And there's not much else to say here. This team does not have a great pass rate. Overall, we're talking about a team sitting at a 46.5% pass rate. We didn't touch on this for the other two teams, but the Guardians are at a 62% pass rate, and Houston's at 58%. Most of these teams are pretty pass heavy, but the Brahmas are neutral to run heavy, which doesn't leave much upside for Cohn. He's not involved in the run game whatsoever, and he's a dink and dunk underneath passer, which leaves much to be desired. Going to the run game for this team, we have Kalen Balazs, Jock Patrick, and John Hilliman. It is basically just Jock Patrick and Kalen Balazs handling the work here. Over the last couple games, we've basically just seen a timeshare. Balazs has narrowly edged out Patrick, 61% of the touches to 37.5%, but it's narrowed over the last couple weeks. It's been about a 60-40 split to be exact, and I think that's what it's going to be moving forward. It's one of the nastier timeshares, full-on timeshares in this league. I would rather play Patrick based on the price. Not too much to say about Balazs. I guess if you're looking for any redeeming quality, you can go to the routes. And even this, it's Balazs handling most of the routes, 60% last week. Patrick, he's down at 32% on the year. So that's at least somewhat redeeming. Not a big fan of this situation. The receiving core, so TJ Vasher's out. We've seen a lot of moving parts. I'm going to pull up their team page on my back end and tell you what I have predicted. Basically, it looks like this is going to be a timeshare to some degree, but we have Tolliver and Travis Johnson listed as the two starters here at 80% of the routes apiece. And then we have Fred Brown listed as the 3. Interestingly, he was not listed as the 3 on the depth chart, but I don't know how much to read into this because they've been sharing time really throughout the year. To break it down for you, you've had Tolliver on the field almost every single play. His route rate is above 80% when active. TJ Vasher was like that too, so he vacates a ton. The second player we talked about, Travis Johnson, his route rate jumped up to 88% last week. And the interesting part here is that Fred Brown was at 92% of the routes last week, but he was listed as a backup to Darius Robertson, who wasn't even targeted. So I think that's probably going to be a timeshare. For an offense we don't have a lot of interest in anyway. I just don't see much reason to get to these players outside of one-offs. And again, it's number 1, Tolliver, number 2, Johnson. From there, I'd go Fred Brown 3, Darius Robertson 4, and then probably Alize Mack 5. He actually has a good route rate of 64%, on the year for this team. He's seen at least 4 targets in every game, so I have no issues with him. Tavinen, no idea how much he plays. He's not been involved. And then, this team is kind of a mess, and they're not pass heavy whatsoever. Going to Seattle, this team is awesome, and Ben DiNucci's got to be the MVP of the league so far. I think he's very clearly just the clear cash play at quarterback. Like you want Ben DiNucci. He actually has pretty good rushing numbers, like very, very sneaky. A lot of them coming via scrambles, but they seem to be okay with him doing that. This team is 1-2, which is laughable to me. I think they might be the second or third best team in the league. They have a 66% pass rate. That's first. They're tied for first in plays per game. So the overall offense is really conducive to fantasy success. And we talked about this at the beginning of the year, that a lot of times you're just going to be able to backdoor big games with the volume DiNucci has. And he's actually been efficient to play the part. So he's awesome. Best quarterback in the league, number one play at the position, not even close. Running back, this is a mess. So Knox was put on their reserve list. I don't think he's going to play this week, but after last week's complete roster upheaval following the Friday video, within 24 hours of game day, I wouldn't put anything past this team. So watch Knox. And that's important because Morgan Ellison has been injured as well. I don't know if he plays. Let's see the latest on him if I miss anything. Nothing. He still has just been limited practicing. Don't know if he plays. And I don't know if it's such a good sign because they signed Darius Bradwell. So talking about this backfield is like the most variant situation we have at this point. It's going to change once we get an actus for the game and see who's actually playing. They use TJ Hammonds as a receiver, but he can play emergency running back. That's what they did last week. And they didn't really even use him. Morgan Ellison essentially handled every single carry, and he had a monster workload. So just for reference, if one back is active for this team, we want to be smashing them. Last week, really the last 2 weeks, 74% of the touches for Morgan Ellison in the backfield. He had 17 carries last week. If he's out and Knox is out, that's going to go to Bradwell. If Knox plays, surprisingly, whether or not he does, I would be very surprised if he did. But if he plays, you could see him getting that workload. Really good situation, but just going to be reliant on late news. The receiver position, again, this team passes a ton. They run a ton of plays. We want to play these receivers. And really the top four, I don't care who you get. I think you just need one of them at least. Ja'Cory Pearson, 90% of the routes. Blake Jackson, 93%. Josh Gordon, 68%. Jordan Veazey, 71%. Play any of them. Even Damian Willis with a 32% route share on the year. If you want to throw a complete dart, don't hate it. Juwan Green, 40% route rate on the year. He was up at 65% last week. I think he's an awesome dart throw at 3,700. Would be a great pivot off Veazey and Gordon, perhaps. Gordon just flat out should not be the most expensive one of these players, or he should be running more routes, one of the two. He does have a good target share on his route rates. I still don't hate Gordon. He's completely fine. The other things to note here, they signed McLean Mannix for some reason. I don't think he plays in the game, but you never know. Again, we don't know what these teams are doing. As far as Seattle goes, they're one of the more straightforward teams in this league, probably because they're one of the better teams. It just hasn't quite resulted in the actual wins yet. But the big thing here is the interesting running back situation. Make sure you follow that. Going to our third game, we have Arlington taking on St. Louis. I don't think any team has frustrated me more than Arlington this year. So for the game itself, this team, St. Louis is a 4-point favorite, and the total is 36.5. It's the lowest on the board. Arlington passes exactly 50% of the time. They're 2-1 this year. They should be 1-2. This team is actually not very good. I can't believe they're 2-1. I would expect Seattle to have this record. But a lot of people complained when Drew Plitt started the first two games and played poorly. They called for Kyle Sloter. Apparently those people did not watch the USFL. Kyle Sloter played. Your prayers were answered, but unfortunately Kyle Sloter was not able to get it done. This team has awful quarterback play, and they're only passing 50% of the time, despite being a pretty bad offense. I don't think they're going to pull the plug for Plitt at any time. If they do, I wouldn't have a lot of confidence either way. Just bad offense overall. No interest outside of the largest tournaments, and still probably not going to get there. At running back, another reason why this team is awful is they slam De'Veon Smith into the back of the offensive line 18 times a game, and he averages about 1 yard per carry. My goodness. I mean, I don't really have anything else to say. He's awful, but he has the best role in the league. So, I mean, he is somebody we should be considering for sure until something changes, and the Arlington coaching staff doesn't appear to be able to evaluate their personnel very well. But in 2 of 3 games, De'Veon Smith has 15 and 18 carries, and then he's extremely involved in the pass game. No, it hasn't really resulted in big receiving games, but he is 9 targets on the year. His route participation is 61%. That is awesome. I mean, he's probably the safest running back play in this league. And if he were to fall in the end zone ever, not that Arlington's going to get there a lot, but if he were to do so, he could easily break the slate, one of these slates. The receiver position for this team is quite difficult to evaluate just because they haven't consistently played receivers one way or, one last thing, a running back. They cut Keith Ford and they signed Kenneth Farrow. That happened late last week, and I don't know how DraftKings hasn't figured this out yet. Kenneth Farrow already played last week. So Keith Ford not on the team. Kenneth Farrow is on the team. That's really the only thing to note. Just complete disaster. If DraftKings can't figure out who's on the rosters, that tells you how much of a disaster this league has been so far. All right. Receivers, a couple guys we know are locked into their roles. Number one, Sal Cannella, the tight end, plays every single snap basically. And then it's basically Tyler Vaughn's after that. The rest of the team has been a mess at receiver, just rotating whimsically based on not performance. I'm not sure based on what, but the top two route participation getters are going to be Cannella and Tyler Vaughn's. That I feel confident about. Beyond that, I feel confident about nothing. I think Brandon Arconado is the 3. His route participation has bounced from 70% to 30%, back up to 75%. I think he's the best bet for the wide receiver 3. And that's when we include Cannella among the pass catchers, but I don't feel good about it. From there, I think the next guy up is maybe Caleb Van Der Esch. He had a 46% route rate after getting signed off the street late last week. That's what I'm talking about. Like, they sign a guy off the street, immediately jumps in for a 46% route rate. I think that can only go up, but I wouldn't bet on it. Essentially, from there, you had Lawan Whittingham. His routes went from 62% to 27%. Not sure why. Sean Monster, 46% route rate, didn't play in week 3. Not sure why. Jordan Smallwood, he's been at about 50% the whole time. So you can clearly see it's essentially rolling the roulette wheel outside of Cannella, Vaughn's, and maybe Brandon Arconado. I don't even feel good about him. So pretty tough to play this Arlington team. Not much interest for me, but you want to roll the dice on your Sloter, Sal Cannella, or Tyler Vaughn stacks. It's not the worst idea. Not the best either. St. Louis, kind of a sneaky team here. A.J. McCarron, we've been talking about him as maybe one of the best actual quarterbacks in this league throwing the ball. This Battlehawks team is 2-1. I think that's pretty reasonable for them. They pass 64% of the time. That's second in the league, averaging 54 plays per game. That's the second fewest. But they did only run 41 plays in week 1. They've actually run a lot of plays since then, so I think this team is probably a little above average in terms of pace. But McCarron's been the most talented actual quarterback. I think it's either him or DiNucci. The thing is, for fantasy purposes, DiNucci's in the better offense, and he runs a little bit. McCarron is a stone statue in the pocket. But we don't have a lot of good quarterback options, so I think he's still a top 3 guy to look at here behind the pass rate. The other interesting notes for this team, they placed Marcel Aitman on injured reserve. They signed Chad Hansen and hybrid running back receiver Puka Williams. We'll talk about that in a second. But overall, still going to include McCarron among the top 3 signal callers to play. From there, Brian Hill came back from his injury and immediately came back and handled the lion's share of the workload. So I think beyond De'Veon Smith, he's the second most secure running back in this league and maybe the first. And maybe he's just on the better offense. I think he's up there at least with De'Veon Smith. Brian Hill participated in 60% of the routes last week. When you look at him in terms of his carry participation, he handled 79% of the running back touches. It was only 11 carries, but again, it's a pass-heavy team, so he's going to see more targets. Brian Hill's awesome. The change of pace was Mateo Durant, and Walker didn't even play. So a lot of love for Brian Hill. I think he's the best price-adjusted running back on this week's slate. At receiver, we mentioned the Marcel Aitman to injured reserve. Apparently, it's not on DraftKings yet, but he's not playing. He's on injured reserve. Anyway, that is the case. So we are now moving forward with the wide receiver 3 rotation of Darius Shepard, Austin Prell, and Hakeem Butler. Hakeem Butler has been one of the most efficient receivers on a per-target basis, a per-route basis this year. Had 11 targets last week. Looks like an actual potential like NFL camp body, and he was a big-bodied, highly drafted receiver coming out of Iowa State. So he should be in a full-time role now with Aitman injured, and he looks like a solid play overall, but I will still play some Shepard and Prell based on the elevated pass rate for this team. Even looking at just one-offs, I'm willing to do that, certainly in stacks. I think another player to look at here is Steven Mitchell. He had a 60% route rate last week, which is pretty good. Nobody else really even cracked enough routes for me to consider. But overall, I do think the Marcel Aitman injury opens routes for both Hakeem Butler and Steven Mitchell. This team does run quite a bit of four wide. They don't use as many tight ends. Haskins has just a 15% route rate. Sutherland, 25%. There's not much to say at tight end. You're going to get a lot of four wide from St. Louis, which wasn't something I expected at the beginning of the year, but something we've gotten nonetheless. Final game, Vegas taking on DC. Okay, this game overall has a 6-point spread in favor of DC, and the total's 41.5, which is the highest on the board. Of course, you should be interested in this. And I'm actually kind of interested in Vegas. I don't think this team is as bad as some other people do. They're 0-3, but I don't think they should be that bad. They lost their opener by 2 points to the Renegades. They outgained them in yards per play. They lost to the Vipers. Excuse me, they are the Vipers. They lost to the Defenders in week 2. No shame there. This is a rematch. And they lost to Seattle last week, who I think is a good team. So I think this team really has just played a more difficult strength of schedule than some others. They're passing 52% of the time, 56 plays per game. It's about league average in both. Brett Hundley took over from Luis Perez, and that is something I'm excited about, if only for the rushing ability. So I don't know what to think of him as a passer, but he has a lot of rushing equity, which should give you quite a bit of interest in a league like this, especially because we didn't see Luis Perez at all last week. So Hundley now, see his carries, lost his name for a second here, was accidentally on the wrong tab. He's now carried 13 times, essentially in 2 games, which is really good. It's about 6.5, 7 carries per game for Hundley. That'll play. It is a tough matchup, but one of my favorite GPP options based on his rushing ability. And then again, they're a balanced offense, so you'll get some passing too. Among the running backs, this is probably the worst situation in the league. We talked about one of the other timeshares. This one is just straight up nasty. You've got Rod Smith, 48% of the touches. John Lovett, 29%. DeAndre Torrey, 22%. Full-blown three-way committee. Not a ton of interest outside of big tournaments, and then it would be just Rod Smith. Receivers, it's actually pretty clear here. I think the only things to really note with this team is that Sean Price has been limited, but no real personnel changes, which is a breath of fresh air. But as far as the pecking order goes, I keep clicking the wrong tabs. That's what happens when you're self-producing the show. I think it's still Jeff Badet, number 1, 91% route rate. Geronimo Allison, 2, 90% route rate. Martavis Bryant, 3, 87% route rate. And then interestingly, they went 4 wide a lot last week. You had Sink Sweeting 60% of the routes and Matthew Sexton 53%. They were almost exclusively 4 wide last week. Gives a little bit of GPP viability to both Sink Sweeting and Sexton as dart throws. But overall, I think these receivers are efficiently priced. I have no issues getting them in one-offs, and of course, I'm going to get one in stacks for sure. Tight ends off the board, they're just not using them. Going to our last team, DC, they're kind of the anomaly of the league. They're running this like really, really run-heavy offense, and they've been successful doing so. This is something, I love my college football. This is something we see at lower levels of football, college football specifically, where maybe teams or analysts sometimes believe, okay, the key to winning football games is throwing the ball. You're most efficient by throwing. And we see that at the NFL level with the highest level of athletes in the sport. If you're not working with the highest level athletes in the sport, a lot of times running can be a key to success. You have quarterbacks that aren't able to actually move the ball in a more efficient way. Running can be a way to do so. And DC has found the perfect balance of this. They only pass 37% of the time. They're using 2 quarterbacks in the run game to keep them fresh. And while this is awesome for a real-life perspective, and it has propelled them to a 3-0 record, it's been tricky to navigate for DFS. What I will say is they've used Tiamu increasingly as a runner, which means you should have more faith in him as a GPP dart throw. Over the last couple games, his rushing equity has increased every single game. He's gone from 4 to 8 to 12 designed runs. So that doesn't even include what he's given you as a scrambler. The floor for Tiamu is now high enough where I'm willing to throw darts on him, whether D'Eriq King plays or not. because he still handles all the pass game work, but now he has a good enough rushing floor where you can play him. Outside of that, the running back situation is certainly noteworthy because of how heavy this team is running the ball. Abram Smith and Raquel Armstead are in about a 60-40 split. But with that said, the run rate is so high that these players are going to have quite a bit of equity too, especially if they get some positive touchdown variance, which you can even see on the screen. The fantasy points per game, it's not gone their way. I think Raquel Armstead is an awesome GPP play at 4.3K. You're not only getting leverage off Abram Smith, but you're getting leverage off the other cheap backs. And again, they run so much. Like for reference, Raquel, we'll just go with strict carry counts over the last couple games. And remember, he was sick in week 2. He's seen 8, 14, and 11 carries. He's only handled 45% of the touches. These touch counts are better than a lot of the running backs that are like 7K and above, just in the raw carry count. So Raquel is certainly in plain view for me. I'll be playing a lot of him as a leverage guy. Among the receivers, so this is kind of an interesting situation. They traded for Alex Ellis at tight end, I think for blocking purposes, but Bradley Moore is also expected to play this week, so I don't know. They've got 4 tight ends on the roster now. As far as the actual just pure receivers go, this isn't a team I have a ton of interest in. Basically, your number 1 is Lucky Jackson. Your 2 is Josh Hammond. I think that's going to ebb and flow to some degree. The number 3 is Chris Blair. I don't have a ton of interest in these guys. They're basically players I would maybe be okay with as one-offs, but if you want to throw them in a stack, I think that's where you really utilize them. Ethan Wolf has been almost an every down tight end for this team. He actually has a 59% route rate, which makes the trade for Ellis even a little more confusing to me. But don't love these receivers. Don't hate them either. I think you can play them as one-offs if you'd like. Oh, Ethan Wolf is out. That explains the trade. He will miss. This is breaking news to me. One that slipped through the cracks, if you will. So that explains the Ellis trade. Luckily, more McKinney's coming back too. So their tight end woes have sort of been fixed via trade. Anyway, that does it for the official breakdown. We'll go position by position, giving you the top plays according to projections real quick here. I think that there will be no surprise at the quarterback position where we have DiNucci 1, McCarron 2, and I'm going to give the edge to Tiamo 3 as my GPP guy based on his rushing ability. Again, 12 design runs last week is no joke. At running back, I think you want to isolate Devion Smith and Brian Hill as your safest guys. And then from there, I have really no issues playing any combination of Balaj, Abram Smith, Borghi. But I really like Raquel Armstead as a pivot down there. I just talked about him and his role with the offense being a little better than some guys priced above him, even though he doesn't have the full lion's share of the workload. Tight end and receiver, we'll include these together. I think for tight end, you're either just playing Latimer or Canella. But at receiver, you still want pieces of Seattle. That'd be either Ja'Cour Pearson or Blake Jackson. You want pieces of Houston. That would be either John Trey Kirkland or Deontay Burnett. But I really like the new role Hakeem Butler could be working himself into with St. Louis as well. Those will be my top 3 at that position. Thank you guys for watching. Again, my name is Matt Gajewski. I'm on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. You can catch all content there. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Let me know in the comments what you think of this video, and we'll be back again next week for more XFL. We'll see you guys next time, and good luck.